studying the sites of contemporary knitting practice in light of advances in digital technology. This is a dissertation centred on understanding the ways in which knitting is learned and practiced in contemporary society. Knitting itself comes with immensely gendered connotations in the domain of the housewife undertaking work in the domestic space. However, the rise in digital technologies in conjunction with urban growth have prompted a change in the way knitting is done today. This project hopes to begin to understand these changes and further contemporary craft discourse through its contribution to the field. Before we get going, I think it's important that we cover a little bit of background on knitting, particularly in relation to its geographies. So Black in 2012 finds that knitting at its most basic is the creation of fabric from a single thread formed into horizontal rows of individual loops that intermesh with each successive row of loops. But surrounding this mechanical definition, there are a range of cultures and meanings that vary from place to place, from individual to individual. Knitting itself has a series of complex histories. Its rise to utilitarian prominence came largely as a part of the First and Second World War, when patterns like this were widely circulated and sent out to aid British troops on the front line who were suffering from Britain's lack of supplies. Then in the 20s, Edward VIII showcasing a farewell jumper in 21, even on a golf course, became the primary ingredient for a boom in 20s era knitwear, with figure-hugging swimsuits, as well as things like Coco Chanel's two-piece that came later. Since an appreciation of the process of knitting has made its way into subcultural fashion, thanks to the like of Vivienne Westwood. So this is from her fall-winter 2013 show, I believe. But she's been doing it a very, very long time. And punk's particular obsession with deconstruction of things and things being put into construction. However, in the 80s and 90s, knitting suffered a decline. Technology was vastly advancing, the markets were de-restricted, big business and shoulder pads shared something in common, and that is that they were both in fashion. But as of late, things started to change. Knitting and more widely craft revival is centred upon shedding much of the domesticated stigma and it's been picked up by a new wave of often considered hipsters, appreciative of the creative capabilities it holds. That's not to say that people aren't still knitting, but this is just a particular brand of knitting. This and their output is often channeled through online sources as part of a wider movement of fourth wave feminism. This, more generally, as well, has been picked up on in the academic sphere with seminal works by the likes of Turney in 2009 and Campbell in 2005, leading the way for craft discourse. If we think about imaginations of the knitter, historically there's a gendered politics to all this of what I would hope is a fading era, marked by inequalities that split the domestic and non-domestic spheres that position women and men firmly in each respectively. However, in the field of geography, we know that does little to really accurately depict knitting as it is today. Knitting shops are beginning to reflect living rooms and cafes as social spaces for like-minded people to meet and take part in the activity. I Knit London, for example, even has a fridge stocked up with drinks, so you can literally while away days in there knitting, bumping into people that come in, conversing with those in the shop. And this kind of growth in the craft has led to a new movement, or a reinvigoration of the movement, so to speak, of artistic knitting. Things like Casey Jenkins' Casting Off My Womb, as well as the Tank Blanket, which is sort of displaying yarn bombing there. This knitting in its more sort of original sense and this type of urban knitting are there to engender alternative interactions with the form and the setting in which it resides. It's in these highly contemporaneous contexts that this project looks to work, not ignoring knitting's history, but rather looking to present its future and its geographies to understand more fully the knitting sites of today. This project utilises three thematic strands as lenses through which to view contemporary knitting practice, and these will go on to form the three research questions, which are these. One, how does embodied and material interaction occur across online and physical knitting spaces? Now, knitting can be learned in the house, as it always has been, but the way in which that is happening is beginning to change. Magazines such as the one that I myself will be using to learn to knit, simply stylish knitting, begun to try and bring together the physical world and the virtual world into more, I don't know if comprehensive is the right word, but a lot more accessible knitting tutorials. A lot of the time when you look at the older diagrams, they're very hard to understand unless you already have an understanding of what each represents. Whereas this, you can get videos with far more kinetic ways of learning. Secondly, what socialities are present in contemporary knitting sites? So knitting has long been considered a domestic and in some respects isolating event. Yeah, people would knit outside of the house in the past even. This would often be to pass the time or to change the nature of the space in which they had to be. So World War II knitting in bomb shelters, for example. The phenomenon of people knitting together is a relatively new one. Meeting to knit together even is a relatively new one, including in shops, in stitch and bitch sessions, and also in online forums. There's a new type of sociality associated with this, and this is what this section will look to understand. So thirdly, what identity politics are present in contemporary knitting practice? Knitting has been considered in the past to be a highly gendered activity, as we've already said, and one that carries with it a certain identity politics. For a long time it's been used to create identity statements in fashion, so we've seen the earlier examples from Chanel or Westwood as contrasting, but it's also gained a certain following in the art world. Similarly, it's been picked up at times hilariously by TV stars like Giles Brandreth, who showcased not only his identity as being someone wanting to wear knitwear, but also the identity of his viewers, who often sent knits like this in for him to wear on television. This, and along with the newer kind of knitting that we're seeing, is leading the way for a progressive mode that's recasting its political nature. What was once seen as traditional and quaint is now seen as the cutting edge of hipsterdom and the drive for a different type of urbanity. Yarn bombing, for example, is a tonic to the hard male image of graffiti, whilst knitting shops and stitch and bitch groups provide an escape from the frightening onslaught of urbanity for many. This is actually one that we did in New York back in my second year on a field trip. With, I think her name is London K. O'Donnell, and she's quite a prolific yarn bomber in New York. So, sites. Those are the themes, and they will be looking across 3 different sites. Firstly is the magazine and the online. So these sources will be used in my bedroom and in my house, and it will be the site in which I learn to knit. Although seeming simple, it presents this kind of place where the physical and the virtual world and their materialities overlap, interact with each other, and engage with my own embodied action in the process of learning. This can also be best visualised in this little book here. So this is a series of books called U Tutorial, and what they do is they select videos, give you a description of the video, but also provide QR codes and hyperlinks. So what we're actually seeing here is the weaving together of virtual and more traditional, real materialities into one site. Next, there's the knitting shops. These will be the second site. They often serve 2 purposes. Firstly, as a shop, selling the materials of the craft, but secondly, as an advice centre for those with problems or seeking advice. Many take on a third role, particularly the ones that I will be using as meeting places and safe spaces for people to knit, as we discussed before. The third and final site will be stitch and bitch groups, spaces in which knitters meet and chat over knitting, sewing or other fibre arts. They're often associated with women, but they operate in a range of spaces, from the male-dominated spaces, such as the pub, say the Daily Mail reporter, to more neutral sites, such as hired-out function rooms and cafes. They constitute a kind of third space, in a way, between the home and the shop. Just a quick idea of the kind of melting pot that I'm working from of literature. There's a lot out there, and pardon the pun, but this is going to be drawing a lot of threads together in this project. So, let's have a look to start with. Craft journals. Of late, there's been a proliferation of new craft journals starting up. This is one very good example of them, the Journal of Modern Craft, which in no way is restricted to knitting. It covers a wide range of craft resources and associated geographies, sociologies, histories, etc. Moving on to the next kind of field, I'll be looking at learning geographies. Part of my work is going to be autoethnographic. I will learn to knit myself. And a lot of this kind of resonates with what Jennifer Lee was saying, leading the way for learning geographies in her piece on Thai yoga massage. And what this does is bring together the gold mine of information between Dreyfus and Deleuze's works to try and pull apart the difference between sort of textbook learning and supervised learning to some extent, and learning through experience. She agrees wholeheartedly with Ingold on the appearance of things, that skill is a social and material practice that is distributed across bodies and context, a form of knowledge that is not localised in individual bodies, but rather assembled across social and geographical settings. This movement towards the learning of skill as messy corporeal act is something I would like to look further into as part of this study. Knitting and digital. So knitting has become ever more involved with digital, in some senses as a way to ensure the continuation of craft, but in others it has serious links going back in history. So if we look at machine code and we also look at knitting patterns, there is a certain similarity in the aesthetic and the way that things are labelled. It's no coincidence that the early pioneers of machine coding were women in the post-war era, a history that we don't hear much about. But some have correlated that to their sort of ability to read knitting patterns, and it develops a certain skill and a way with this kind of stuff. What we're looking at here in this scarf is a source code that has been translated into a knitting pattern. So anything in binary works with the same kind of knitting, because knitting in effect is quite binary. You either knit or you purl, and you just assign one to the other. This is the source code of Ravelry, a knitting online forum. And then over here we see a Dickensian character whose name has just escaped me. Oh no. Madame de Frage, who would knit code into pieces. Knitting and materiality. Knitting is of course a deeply material act, and when we look to people such as Dant and Watson and Sherv on their work on DIY and crafting, we find there's this type of assemblage between the craft of the tool and the material they're actually working with. I believe that this holds true here, and it's something I'm certainly interested in continuing to study. Materiality